Okay, two things real quick. First of all, I think the movie was created from the guy's anger at God, but the movie itself is about God's anger. Okay, that's one thing. Second of all, I also think that this is actually an expression of the author's idolatry. Because it's idolatrous to say, here is the image I think God should live up to, and when God doesn't live up to my image of what God is supposed to be, then God is not my God, or God is something not worthy to be worshipped. But as soon as you create an image of God, you now have an idolatrous situation, because you're not supposed to have an image of God. So if my image of God is that God is supposed to do X, Y, Z, my image of God doing X, Y, Z is still an idolatrous creation, and not what God is. So I think this is actually an expression of his idolatry.
I don't disagree, except I do disagree in one part, that I don't think it is possible to believe in God without having some kind of image. But you have to remember never to make absolute.
Which is what he did.
That's right. You can never, and the church teaches this, by the way. It's what I always call it in the similitudo clause, which in the Fourth Lateran Council, it says in the Fourth Lateran Council, when comparing creator and creature, no similarity can be asserted without acknowledging the greater dissimilarity. Meaning, now listen to that, when comparing creator and creature, no similarity can be asserted without acknowledging the greater dissimilarity. Whatever image you have of God, which you have to have, because we think in images, we can't think without images, that image is more unlike the real God than like the real God. So don't make the image, which I think is that what he's doing.
Right. And
he's relating to God.
And he's making it an absolute.
An absolute.
And then when God doesn't live up to his image, he turns around and hates God.
See, my negative image of God is still a temptation. I have a temptation to revert to that negative image of God. And it's a temptation left over from childhood. If you want to.
Well, I think we come to it. You have been socialized, I have been socialized, Stuart has been socialized and brought up in a particular faith tradition. Those things are bequeathed to us. We inherit those ideas. We inherit those traditions. And then I think it's really appropriate for us to analyze it and deconstruct it and to think about it and reflect on it ourselves. I think all healthy believers, believers in God, need to do that. It's not just enough to say, yeah, what he says, or yeah, what you say. But each of us need to get to the point where we say, well, this is my experience of God. Sometimes light, sometimes dark, sometimes great, sometimes not so great, but that's the way relationships are. And I think we got to learn to be okay with that, ultimately.
And that's why ultimately the other name for the Jews is Israel, which means those who wrestle with God.
Yeah. That's a real important point. You know, you should. If God, I worry about people whose God rests comfortably in their hands. I worry about that because you should be wrestling with God. Because no image of God is correct. Every image has some truth, but every image is also false.
Which is why I say that you better choose your theology carefully, because it will paint you into a corner you can never get out of.
Yeah, and which is why I say that theology and the study of philosophy and theology has been, to a large degree, my liberation. Because I have been able to take the religious ideas that I got and trace them and literally say, where did this start? And is this correct? Is it true? And how did that come together? And that's why I love etymologies and historical theology and stuff like that. Because every time I see something, an image of God or anything like that, something in the church, I ask the question. And I'm always frustrated when I see people who don't ask questions. You know, and by the way, that's why I have long homilies. You know why? I seriously, when I get excited about this stuff. And I can't believe that you're not. I can't believe that somebody, you're talking about God, about the future, about who at the center of reality, what it's all about. And I still remember sitting in graduate school and in college, having a professor give a fantastic lecture, and I was like this. And I see people after 5 minutes, 10 minutes going, yeah. If you're one of those, don't tell me.
Don't burst his bubble.
No, okay. Okay, so that's the first 30 minutes. I think we did it fairly well. And now, I think what we'll do, and Steve, you are the monitor. What I think we'll do is, at least for a while, we'll take one question from the floor, hopefully having to do with what we're talking about, and then one written question. And go back and forth like that. Okay, Steve.
The first question is for the rabbi. Would you comment on Rabbi Kaplan's concept of God that suggests the Jewish people created an ethical God out of their ultimate need, and then this God provides the power for a person to pursue higher goals and ideals?
Okay, the person asking the question is referring to a new movement of Judaism that's only about 90 years old. It's called Reconstructionist Judaism. It was founded by Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, who the questioner is referring to, who was a rabbi with an Orthodox background who was at the conservative seminary in New York, Jewish Theological Seminary, who was also a PhD in sociology. And his entire look at religion was through the eyes of a sociologist, including his look at Judaism. And so when he said, actually his book is called Judaism as a Civilization. And his thesis is that Jews are a civilization, first and foremost, that created out of their civilization and their own mores and beliefs a God that reflected those beliefs. And for the purpose of, Steve, what was, for the purpose of, how did he word it?
Where am I? For their ultimate need, then provides the power for a person to pursue higher goals and ideals.
Right. So God is an invention of human beings, and the Jewish invention reflects the already existing mores and laws and customs and attitudes and beliefs and values of the social group called the Jewish civilization. Okay. An end result or a product of that theology, of that belief, is that there's no such thing as a miracle, because God, an invention of human beings, is just as much under the laws of nature as human beings are, so that God cannot change nature to suit God's purposes or needs or whatever. The second element to Kaplan's theology is that basically there's no covenant, because the stories of the Hebrew Scriptures were invented by this sociological group called the Jews to reflect their values and their mores and everything else. He was also very much a pantheist, that God is found in nature, God is not above and outside of nature, which is why you can't have miracles, but God is found within nature. All of which is antithetical to the Judaism of about 4,000 years, okay, is the pure product of a sociologist, and for which I would reject it as anything truly Jewish. Now, having said that, you know, back when I was in high school, and marginally part of the speech and debate program, there is two ways to approach a status quo. One is to change the status quo completely, get rid of it. And the other one is to take new programming to modify the status quo. And what Mordechai Kaplan did was the latter, to create programming to modify the existing status quo. Mordechai Kaplan is the inventor of Jewish community centers. Because if you have a civilization, then a civilization is going to have its expressions that include everything that you find at a YMCA or a Jewish community center. So he founded the JCC movement, basically. Mordechai Kaplan's daughter was the first female in the Western world, which most people don't know about, to have a bat mitzvah. So in the Western world, in the modern period, that could be considered to be a Reconstructionist invention too. So the Reconstructionist rabbis, who by the way have to have a master's degree in social work, which as a sociologist you'd expect them to have to do, tells you their mentality on Judaism, which I completely and totally reject as anything truly Jewish. But the programming they create is the most innovative programming you'll find. Their rabbis are always the coolest and they're up with this electronic stuff. but their theology, no, rejected, not Jewish.
Thank you, Rabbi. You want to take a question from the audience?
Yeah, but I'm sensing a flaw because we'd like to move in between all of us. Is there any question from the floor that would be either for David or myself?
Nah, why bother?
I wanted to ask David. His view on personal interpretation of Scripture. Oftentimes, I'll see preachers take a single verse or even a partial verse and spend half an hour or longer in some great truth, but one verse of Scripture, I have trouble with that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. I knew a fellow back in seminary whose goal was to preach one sermon on every verse of Scripture. One homily on every. I think there's like 700,000 verses or something, so it's a huge number, and obviously that would not be achievable in a lifetime. One of the things that I would like for Protestants to do, they don't do very well. Very often you'll hear this. They'll read a very brief passage of Scripture, and so Scripture is 1 minute. And we claim to be people of the Bible, right? People of Scripture. But what happens, realistically, is that there's a very brief reading of Scripture, followed by 30 minutes of sermon, which is a lot of interpretation in and of and about that Scripture. What I'm trying to do with some of the work that I'm doing is trying to turn that around. Let's read Scripture for 30 minutes, and then spend about a minute reflecting on, in terms of what I think about it, and let the Scripture itself speak. I would very much prefer that. What I do think about this, and I've studied Scripture quite a bit. I care a lot about these things, so I think Scripture is very important for us, both as Christians and Jews, and as Catholics and Protestants. I do think the Catholic faith is built upon Scripture, and that it resonates with Scripture, and that as I read and look at the Catechism, I see it sort of laced and Scripture being very important. But I do think that we are groomed to read Scripture in a particular way. Going back to your analogy, as a child, growing up in the Baptist church, I heard it read, I heard it commented on, and as I did, I learned to read Scripture that way. And I think that's probably an okay thing. I just need to realize the limitations of that. I need to realize that there are different ways of looking at and reading. There's different approaches to Scripture. And I can be enriched by that. And that's why these kind of conversations are so helpful for me. Father Mario's way he reads Scripture is helpful for me. The way that Stuart reads Scripture is helpful for me. I hope that the way I do it is helpful to them. I think we need that kind of conversation. But we have to do that with humility. And say, look, this is what I see here. What do you see? And it's not to say I'm not firmly and deeply committed to that. I think we must be. But I think we need this, what one person calls a generous orthodoxy. Just to be very generous in our disposition toward others. But I think Scripture is vitally important. We need to read it, we need to know it, but we need to read it well. And it is the misreading of Scripture that has created some denominations, not Baptists, but some other denominations. It's the misreading of Scripture that gives us the David Koresh kind of thing that we saw back in '93. It's the misreading of Scripture that I think gives us a lot of ills in the world. So I'm committed to a deep, abiding, and a humble reading of Scripture.